Hello again, everybody, and welcome to another episode of Fun and Games Podcast. I'm Geoff Moonen,
And I'm Matt, a.k.a. Stormageddon.
and we want to ride the momentum of our last episode a little bit. We were talking about emulation, and there is a much wider discussion to be had about who owns a game once you've bought it, as well as what happens to games in previous generations. How do we preserve these things? And with things like DRM still being a hot topic, it's a bit of a gray area, I think.
Yeah, we've touched on this a little bit in the past when we talked about digital libraries and our Steam libraries and digital content. But the reality is this is a tale as old as time, all the way back to music and even literature. Like, once you've purchased a work, is it theirs anymore or is it yours? You know, there's often a lot of contention in the music community about whether the artist controls the narrative or you do. You know, as far as if a song means something to you, does it really truly matter what the artist intended for that, or is it yours? Most people agree that it's yours. Your interpretation is the interpretation that matters because that's what you're getting out of the art. But some may argue otherwise. But for sure, of course, talking about classic games like we did last week, and how physical copies of certain games are becoming impossible to find because they just don't produce them anymore. This idea that they own these games once they've been released, especially once they've been... under a legal standpoint, yes, Nintendo owns all of their Nintendo games that they've ever released. But if they're not releasing new cartridges of Nintendo, Super Nintendo, N64 games, and people still want to play them, does Nintendo have the right to enforce this stranglehold on emulation?
Yeah, it's easy to forget that the public domain, a lot of things exist in the public domain, but the expiration date or the period of time before an original work enters the public domain used to be a lot shorter. But I believe it was mostly Disney that pushed to have it be, 99 years after the death of the creator? Something to that degree. And whichever it actually is, video games have always existed in that sort of time frame. So it's going to be a long, long time before any video game, any computer game, any arcade game enters into the public domain. And by then, a lot of original content will most likely have been lost. And given that the people who publish also control the medium itself, you run into other areas. Like, one particular aspect that I feel we do ourselves a disservice with a sort of stranglehold is translations.
Mm-hmm.
If a story or a book, a poem, a play needs to be translated into another language, even well after the fact, there's a classic poem, or you want to translate Shakespeare into Klingon, or to be a little ridiculous and referencey, you don't necessarily have to go to the original publisher for that. There are multiple translations that can be made of the original text of something. And in fact, people debate the merits of it. There are still new translations of old Greek epics, ancient Greek epics to this day. New stuff is coming out. But a translation patch for a game that came out 20 years ago can be hit with some pretty hard cease and desists. And the idea of how it can be produced or come out it all feels very back alley, when I really feel it shouldn't. But again, the company owns the original property, and there's no kind of allowance or wiggle room for at what point does that ownership end?
Yeah, famously, with the Mother series, for those in the States know it as Earthbound, is the only game we got properly released in the States. Like, there have been so many fan translations of the other games because, they just haven't released them in the States, but they get shut down or forced to the side, or even think of, ASM2R or whatever it was, which was
another Samus Returns.
Yeah, where someone took Samus Returns, updated the graphics, added a narrative, and then Nintendo shut it down, and less than 6 months later, probably even shorter than that, they released their own version, which is now, of course, popularly known to be released on the 3DS of their re-release. And so, there was a huge project when I was still in college. Someone was trying to 3D render Chrono Trigger and release it a 3D version for free, not trying to steal money from Nintendo, but they just wanted it with like the PlayStation era graphics. And then it got shut down. And then, of course, they released a PlayStation copy with new cutscenes. And so it's always interesting to me what games get strangleholds on them and others that don't, because it depends on what's actually coming out at the time. And it seems like when a company wants to re-engage with that nostalgia, they then put this kind of stranglehold. I mean, it makes sense for Nintendo to start pushing the way they are because they've released the NES and SNES Classic, and we debated what would be on an N64 Classic, but the reality is an N64 Classic, a Game Boy Classic, these aren't out of the realm of possibility. So, from a money-making standpoint, it's not super bizarre for Nintendo to do this, but I still feel like they're hurting their community as a whole by doing it.
Yes, they are. And to be fair, the NES Classic has, was it 30 games on it?
Yeah.
And they are absolutely fantastic. But there is a total of 714 known licensed games on the Nintendo Entertainment System, according to Wikipedia on my phone right now. And that is, to my math, less than 700 games that are not on the NES Classic.
Right.
I know, it's 686.
The reality is that, if they were re-releasing a smaller Nintendo that would play Nintendo cartridges and had games installed on it, that would be a different story. Because that, I think, would be really great. Because then it would give something for classic collectors to work towards, because they'd have a working console, but they'd also have stuff digitally on the system if they couldn't get anything. So someone like me who's not a collector, I could get the NES Classic, and if I wanted to play other Nintendo games, I'd have to go find them, but I'd still have those basics installed. But that's not what they did. They released a smaller version of the console that's a glorified USB drive, essentially, as far as it's something that has the data stored on it. There's really no reason they couldn't have made a functioning Nintendo that also had games preloaded on it. But I guess they didn't want to engage with people. Because you have to imagine also Nintendo knows that some people still have hundreds of Nintendo games. Like, why you wouldn't give a new way for people to play those old games if they already had them, but maybe their NES died. Like, why wouldn't you do that? It just kind of seems like a no-brainer to me.
Well, there's also to consider the fact that each successive console generation has felt progressive, exponentially so. And I don't mean in any other way than progress. In a sense of the graphics are better, the sound is better, the worlds are bigger, the gameplay is longer, the audio has greater fidelity, and we leave the old things behind. We don't need to go back to that old color palette. We don't need to be held back by those old restraints anymore. Why do we even look back on it? Except for the occasional re-release because there's money to be made. But over the last 10 years, let's just say, arbitrarily, let's say the last 10 years, there's been a lot of great retro-style new releases. Mm-hmm. I mean, Matt, you and I have sung the praises of several of them.
Yes.
And there's ever more coming out. As of this recording, I just today saw the trailer video for Gato Roboto at PAX West, which it wears its influences on its sleeve. Everything it's going to run on is capable of doing so much more, but it is still a wonderfully designed game, or I'm sure it will be.
Yeah.
I mean, the aesthetics, definitely. And it also, we are now looking back on older games and going, well, that was a really cool idea. We weren't ready for it. It was too off the beaten path, or what you were working with couldn't quite get that idea out. But now there are games nowadays that owe their influence, owe their DNA, their ancestry to a lot of sort of failed games, or games that didn't have as good of sales figures as they could have or should have. And because they didn't have those sales figures then, they may never get re-released. And so, I mean, I'm checking figures now as we're talking about this. There was there's 714 licensed games, so official seal of Nintendo on that thing. 30 on the NES Classic, 94 were released on Virtual Console. And that is the other official way that Nintendo has brought these things back to us.
Right.
And I don't even want to talk about the paltry amount of PS1 games that have been released on the PS1 classics.
Yeah.
As and on and on and on. And as the history goes long enough, we look at, well, those were simpler times. Those were backward this, there was this and that. So why do we need to go back to it? Because it's important. Because gameplay ideas sometimes aren't in the right time period. They come too early, or they were too ambitious, or sometimes it's kind of fun to just go back and look at roots. And so it's given that you think of the console wars of the 16-bit generation and then the PlayStation and Saturn and the whole Jaguar debacle, there was such a push for don't look back. And now that we want to, there is so much momentum going forward. And I don't know what it's going to take. It's going to take a lot of legal dexterity, I think, to get a full library released to the people in its way. And in the meantime, well, there's going to conventions and flea markets and garage sales, which is where I find a lot of fun stuff.
Sure, but, it hurts the folks who don't have a physical console,
Agreed.
And they don't always have the consoles at those conventions. And what's surprising to me is, like, you're talking about modern games that just came out recently, like the Bloodstained prequel game, which we both played, and The Messenger, which just came out, are both games that are so heavily influenced by the games they're based on. I mean, one of them is being made by a legendary creator in the space, which is Bloodstained. Yeah. But, like, even The Messenger, it plays with 8-bit and 16-bit aesthetics in the game mechanics and is super fourth wall breaking. And yet, clearly influenced by Ninja Gaiden and the like, but has a Metroidvania style section as well. And, like, the fact that these companies wouldn't want to re-release these games when they're at their height of their popularity. I mean, can you imagine if Shovel Knight, who's been partnering with tons of other indie companies and is finally in April of next year releasing its 2 final add-on pieces, which is their final campaign edition and a fighting game edition, which is insane, all part of the treasure trove. Can you imagine playing one of those games, but, like, getting to be Mega Man, and instead of having the shovel like Shovel Knight, you're Mega Man and you get the different shovels from the different enemies as you defeat them, or that kind of integration of these companies partnered or worked together or re-released games, or re-released a version of Mega Man 2 that had Shovel Knight in it instead, and he gets special ability, like that kind of crossover that you could do with these other companies. It makes sense to me. I know with the digital age and with the DRM era, like, everyone's worried about who owns what. But I think there's so much to be said about partnership. I mean, Nintendo's starting to do that. They partnered with Microsoft to bring Minecraft crossover play between the Xbox One and the Switch. Same thing with Fortnite, bringing as many consoles as they could together, and the PC, Paladins, and all of these other online or differing console games working together. I would love to see some library crossover. Like, if Nintendo ever released any of their digital games on other consoles, people would go bonkers. And it's not like they wouldn't make any money doing it either. I think we're still a while from that, but it just feels like as we're wrapped up in this forward momentum, there's still so little willingness to work together. Nintendo has always been pushing that, and the Smash Brothers series has been a great example of that, working with other developers to use their and publishers to bring their content onto that game, a la Mega Man and Snake and Bayonetta,
and the
Sonic
Belmonts.
And the Belmonts. Like, we're starting to get there, but I'm just afraid that by the time we get a full functioning digital library of Nintendo or Super Nintendo games or N64 games, that people aren't gonna be as hungry for it. And what's really crazy is, you say that number before, over 700 Nintendo games. There is no way I ever owned an eighth of those games, like, let alone the whole library. Like, I think maybe when all was said and done, I owned 30. Nintendo games, and most of them were popular Nintendo franchises. Like, I would love to have access to that full library of 700 games or so, because I would play so many of them because I'd never played them before.
Yeah, and there's naturally going to be shovelware in there, but that's for you to decide.
Well, yeah, and also, like, with Nintendo's new online service, which as of this recording has not been released yet, we're about 15 days or so away from its release, since it's supposed to come out the second half of September. But, like, they've already announced like 20 Nintendo games that are going to be available, but again, it's such a tiny number, and it's not the same games that are on the Nintendo Classic. So there's some, the NES Classic, but there is some overlap. But I just worry, like, where is, like, I think the idea, first of all, of a Netflix style subscription service for Nintendo that allows you to play online and get access to just a ton of Nintendo games is brilliant, but they need to build it out more. Now, truth be told, Netflix's library wasn't as big as it is now when it first started. It was actually very tiny. And so what I'm really hoping is that this Nintendo service will eventually lead to a Netflix-style library, but for Nintendo games that, as long as you're paying for it, you get access to the entire library. But it doesn't seem to be quite going in that direction yet. It still seems fairly limited.
Right. And well, one of the big difficulties that I can see off the top of my head is the fact that because it will be so long before things fall into the public domain, there are a lot of defunct developers as well as developers that have been absorbed by other studios. And it comes to a very interesting question of, well, we want to put this game on the surface. Great. From whom do we get permission? If you want a really interesting look into licensing and the idea of like who owns what, if you have an hour, because I'm pretty sure it's an hour, the Gaming Historian has a fantastic video about the history of Tetris, and there is an insane, like, I did not realize, I'm not surprised, but I did not realize it went so deep, daisy chain of deals, of people selling rights before they got the permission to sell the rights, but they did, and they negotiated, and it was because this person shifted a little, suddenly 6 other deals fell apart. And I imagine even if you go, 5 years ago, let alone 30 years ago, there are so many companies that are gone, or like but these things are gone now. Or does it belong to the company, the programmer? Does it belong to whom? And I can see where that would be a big difficulty, but I can't imagine that only means we have access to 90 games out of 714.
Right.
Let's even subtract the ones that weren't released in North America, which puts us to a grand total of, I'm scrolling down the list a little here, 679.
Yeah, it's not that huge of a difference.
679 North American NES games. So that's not Famicom, that's not PAL only, that's not Australia. We are Americans talking about American video games.
Right, yeah.
But
we welcome other listeners' takes as well, but we can only speak from our own experience.
Oh, and this can only get worse for PAL region.
Oh, for sure.
I mean, like, that's one of the other things. Like, it's already murky grounds here in the States. Like, if we start throwing in these other ones, we're going to have a 4.5-hour discussion here. There's going to need to be charts and legal counsel. Yeah. So let's stick with domestic.
Yeah, sure. I mean, also something to really worry about, we mentioned DRM earlier, is like when people said at one point, oh, you'll be paying full price for a game to practically rent the game, we laughed. But, essentially that's what we're doing. Now, I mean,
yeah.
a site like Steam has a great setup and methodology. And for the most part, if you bought the game, you own it forever. As far as they're concerned, you just have to re-download it from computer to computer as you get newer equipment. But the reality is, if one day, for example, Capcom decides that they don't want the Devil May Cry series to be on Steam anymore, they could pull it down and they owe you nothing. I actually have a great example of this. As I've talked about it before on this show, I loved the MMO City of Heroes. I was obsessed with it, played it all the time. Unfortunately, NCSoft and its partnering studio, Cryptic Studios, both kind of went under. They still sort of exist in their own capacities, but City of Heroes is done. I still have the City of Heroes Architect Edition on my Steam, and I can't remove it because I own the DRM, but the game doesn't exist anymore. And so I can stare at it in my list of games, but I can't download it. I can't delete it. It's just there.
And one of the more infamous examples of that on consoles was the Scott Pilgrim game on the PS3 and the 360. And because the license expired, I believe was the reason, you can now no longer purchase it or download it. If you already had it, great. But I didn't have a PS3 or an Xbox 360 at the time, so I will never have the game.
Yep.
Even more thorough is the very infamous example of PT.
Yes.
Yes, the Silent Hills trailer that was released as viral marketing, released as if it was a trailer for a completely different kind of game from an independent studio, and it was a beautiful microcosmic horror experience. Like, honestly, at this point, I hope, if Silent Hills even came out, it probably wouldn't live up to what that was. But it was taken off of, PlayStation Store, Microsoft, all that. And then I don't remember how, but like basically if you updated your system firmware, it got erased. Like you couldn't keep a copy of it even. Now granted, that was a demo. No one paid anything for it. But it also is a very terrifying example as to what you're talking about, Matt. That idea of like, do you own it? Do you really? It's not even like the kind of thing of it fails on your side, and so you should have backups on your hard drive. It's if the marketplace you got it from falls apart, you have to give it back.
Yeah, and we're at a point now where so many games are also updated digitally, even if you buy them physically, that we can run into that trouble with that as well. Now, as far as I can tell, on the Switch as an example, but I'm sure it was the case with other handhelds, if you're playing a game physically that has digital updates and you're not on Wi-Fi to download the newest update, you can still play the game. However, if it's a multiplayer game, you cannot play with anyone who has the updated version. I ran into this trouble when I was on my honeymoon. I had brought my 3DS and I had made friends on the boat, and while Sarah was doing something else, I was going to play Smash Brothers on the 3DS with this new friend I had made. I booted up, we're about to play, and then it says I can't connect to him, even though we're doing it in physical space near each other where you just need a signal between the two 3DSs. And then when I exited the game and checked updates, it turned out it was not updated. I was not going to pay $20 a minute to use the boat internet to update my 3DS. But that was really annoying because it meant I could not play with this person. Even though I owned the game, he owned the game. And we were able to our DSs were able to detect each other. It was because of that stupid download I couldn't play with him.
It's as if a book gets a new edition and you're not allowed to read it until someone comes to your home or you bring it to a place to get the offending passages whited out or new pages put in.
Yeah.
And I often think about book editions and plays and the like when it comes to re-releases of games. Because I am fine with games being re-released, whether it's you're able to play it on your new hardware, or they give it an HD update, or something a little different. Which reminds me of different editions of classic stories. Mm-hmm. I have my complete Alice, which is the Alice in Wonderland and Through the Looking Glass, but it's got the Martin Gardner footnotes and annotations. It's a beautiful edition, hardcover. I love it. It's got like all of the old illustrations. To me, that feels like a Game of the Year edition. And it is a bit tricky, though, when you come into this idea of, okay, let's look at, different releases of a game as different editions. That totally makes sense. And the same thing as, different translations of something. You're like, I like the way they do this passage, but I don't like that one. I like being able to play Chrono Trigger on the go, but I really don't like the anime cutscenes.
Right.
That sort of thing. And unfortunately, with DLC, with updates, with the very situation you talked about on your honeymoon, it becomes harder to pinpoint to, well, this is the game. And when it comes time to archive it, when it comes time to bring it out of the vaults one way or the other, what version, what is the game? What is like this digital, physical, whatever artifact of, is it the experience? Is it the world? Is it the story? Is it what? And I believe that's one of the other difficult boundaries to figure out when it comes time to talk about who owns the game. Well, what is the game? I guess.
Well, yeah, I think also a company that's done something similar for many years, and I feel like we've even brought this up on the show, is the Disney Vault. And even though they are launching a streaming service soon, which may undo the existence of the Vault, but for many, many years, especially in the VHS era, movies were available on VHS for X amount of time after the movie came out, and then it goes into the Vault, and you can't, like, unless store has a backstock, you can't get it anymore until it comes out of the vault. And like, I worry about that with some of these games doing the same thing.
Yeah, and it is a little bit. I mean, when you run into companies that will publish limited amounts of a physical copy of a game, guys like Limited Run Games, they can only make so many, and they sell out quick, and then it turns into an interesting sort of market. And it's a little easier with a film because it's got, from start to finish, you've got its runtime. Does it have all the scenes? Great. Off it goes. Whereas if you are releasing the Batman Arkham games, does it need to have all of the DLC or does it not? Which particular build are we working with? Is it the original build? Or is it the build that everyone plays the most? Is it when we want to re-release Arkham Knight 20 years from now, is it going to be the PC port? Please don't let it be the PC port.
Yeah.
And these are the questions that, because over the years, video games is such a like, oh, it's a kid thing, or oh, it's a whatever. And yes, we on this podcast are well past that point. We see them as a serious thing. And that is why I'm asking this question as to how do we keep games from getting forgotten, getting lost, getting destroyed irretrievably?
Well, yeah, and I think it's a fair question. I think you bring up DLC, which is a good thing, and we need to have a knockdown, drag-out conversation about DLC on another opportunity. But I was reading stuff earlier today. They're already announcing characters that will be in the DLC of the new Spider-Man game that, as of when you're hearing this, will have just come out. But as of when we're recording this, it's about 4 days earlier. It's not out yet. And what drives me bonkers about gaming today is advertising DLC before the game is done. It's like, even if you have teams working on it, which I sort of get, don't talk about it yet. Keep it a surprise, because all it looks like when you're working on DLC concurrently with game releases for that game is that you don't care about enough about the original package. You held stuff back on purpose to release it as DLC, or either way, you're giving the impression of either or. Even if your intentions are for pure good to have more content faster and you're creating it at the same time, arguably that team could work on the main game and include some of that in the main game. When does content become DLC? And how is that fair to the people who want to own that content?
Yeah, absolutely. And again, there is the fact that, okay, maybe they are putting these things together after, because there is a period of time. The game has to go gold. It has to be approved for publish.
Right.
And there's a little bit of extra time from there to when it can go out, but you can't change it from there. It's like when a play goes up. In previews, you can fiddle with it, you can change around, whatever. But once it's up, once it's opened, you don't really make sweeping changes to the production anymore. It's gone gold in its way. And so, yes, maybe they've started this DLC or they couldn't get it done before the game went gold. But you're absolutely right. I know that a game goes gold, and a lot of people know that a game goes gold. Not everyone does. And it doesn't look great when you're announcing it before the game's even out. And yeah, again, this just further means that there's going to be do I now just sit on my hands until you come out with the Spider-Man, Big Apple edition or whatever it is that has all the stuff on it?
Yeah, I mean, this leans back to the season pass stuff, which we've talked about before, and the idea that why should you need a season pass on launch day for a game when you don't know when the DLC is coming out? Oh, so it's cheaper? Like, looking at Mario and Rabbids for the Switch, because that's the game I own that I can think of off the top of my head that had a season pass and has since come out with DLC. There's been a bunch of like new weapons and different stages and blah 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 that they added, but the first full DLC with Donkey Kong recently came out, and it's cheaper than the season pass, or maybe close to around the same price. So like, if I don't want all that other crap, then waiting for the DLC makes sense. But they're promoting the season pass like you're going to want all of this stuff, and it's like, it's again, when does DLC become additional content versus stuff removed from the game to release later at a cost? It becomes money hungry a bit. At first I thought GameFly was going to be a great service because, like Netflix, you'd be able to get these games sent to you and play them, but it wasn't that straightforward. You had a priority list, and if it wasn't in stock, and they didn't do it digitally, and I think since then other service providers have done like a digital subscription for access to gaming. I know Xbox One does that. If you're a Windows user and you sign up for their subscription service, any Xbox game that comes out that's Microsoft made, you get access to on your PC without hesitation. That I think is really great, and I think is a step in the right direction for these kinds of services, but I still don't think that Xbox service allows you to get older games. I think it's just like the Xbox One generation games you can download and play. Anything that came out for the 360 or earlier, you don't have access to.
Right. And also the fact that we do push as hard for digital as we do. I might feel a little differently about it if, say, at the end of the DLC cycle that a game had, it came out with like a bonus disc or this is the extra stuff.
Right.
So you're not feeling like you're buying the game several times or you have to invest in it or any of the stuff that we said in that previous episode. But, if you want to release the Royal Edition of Final Fantasy 15, that's fine. But if you've already bought Final Fantasy 15 and you just want to, I don't know, and if you're going back to it, or say you're going back to something on the PS3, if I really wanted to play Lightning Returns, but I want all the costumes, and none of them are pre-order bonuses, well, a few were, but you want to release a bonus disc for that, great, but I can't go back and get that stuff anymore. Now, were they important to the game or not? Who's to say?
Right.
But you're the one that's putting it there, and you're the one that's enticing with it. And so now this just becomes a very strange thing of, how many appendices and PSs do you want to your book now?
Yeah.
It's frustrating.
Yeah. Well, and also it goes back to the backwards compatibility conversation that we've had several times. And logically, there's really no reason that every system doesn't have backwards compatibility. I mean, there are logistics and there are costs, but
plenty.
I feel like it's, again, giving people access to the breadth of what they'd had before. I am a registered Sony gamer. I only skipped the PS3. I've had every other system. It is not hard to find some way to track that information, especially now going forward. If we can't for the original 2 PlayStations, that's fine. But with the PlayStation ID, there's no reason why you can't track the games that people own for the 3 and the 4 and allow access to those games from the 3 through some semblance of streaming or emulation. Because we have logins for literally everything now, there's no reason why I can't play these games in multiple locations on multiple consoles. It's not really that hard. I'm sure there's some engineering magic and development magic that needs to happen, but I guarantee it's not as complicated as some of these companies make it out to be. They just don't want to allocate the resources.
Well, I mean, PlayStation does have PlayStation Now.
Yes, it does, but still, I feel like it's lacking in library size.
True. It's again the virtual console issue where they get to determine what of the library you have access to. And it's kind of a funny thing. Also speaking as somebody who, as of now, owns every PlayStation console. I own a PS TV, I have a PSP, I have the Vita, and I have 1 through 4. If there's let's not count Net Eurose.
Okay, fair enough.
And so part of that is the fact that there's some games that I'm only going to be able to get on one form, whereas others it was okay. As of this recording earlier this week was Metal Gear Solid's 20th anniversary, the original PS1 game. And I wanted to spend the day playing it, but I was going to be out of the house. So there were other plans or other things going on. It was Labor Day. So I'm like, well, it's a PS1 classic. Surely I can play it on my Vita. I can play it on the Vita, except you can't access it from the Vita on the PlayStation Store, nor can you buy it on your computer to send to your Vita. You have to download it on your PS3 and then link your PS3 and PS Vita together and transfer the file over. And it has to be the download file. So if you already have it installed on your PS3, you have to re-download it and send it to your PS Vita. I did it because I love Metal Gear Solid and I wanted to play it on the subway, and it's been amazing. But there's a lot of hoops to jump through, and that is just for one game, and that is for one that is, I want to say, fairly popular, fairly well known. Has, there's a good. It's like, well, of course you're going to have that there. You look up any top 10 lists of PlayStation games, it's in the top 5. So yes, naturally. But what about the more obscure games? And not even deeply obscure, like something like Azure Dreams or Wild 9 or anything like that. Games that are known, but they're not going to show up on any best ofs.
Yeah. Or think about like The Bouncer from PS2. Like,
yeah,
that's a game that's never going to show up anywhere. But
nope.
It was a fun game. It was Square Enix's attempt, then Squaresoft, at a beat 'em up, and I thought it was a lot of fun. It was definitely flawed, but it was a lot of fun. They've never made another game like it. It never shows up on best of lists. It never shows up on Square Enix's radar anywhere. It's like it doesn't exist.
And it would be worth going back to,
yes.
Even in a and especially because like there's so many games that, going as a collector, you look and you go, all right, I'll spend $5 on this game, easy. Even if I only play it for 2 hours, that's cheaper than a movie ticket. And something like The Bouncer, yeah, I remember criticisms about it being short, about a lot of other issues about it, but one of the big ones being how short of a game it was. Well, if it's part of a bigger streaming service, or if it's part of a Square Enix collection or bundle or what have you, if you allow easy access to it, let people judge for themselves, and its own merits can be determined.
Yeah. I think that ultimately there's so much gray area. Like, yes, technically Nintendo owns all their properties. Like, that's the most oversimplified version of this point. But the reality is, once the ability to get a game like, I own a copy of The Bouncer. I have no idea how much it sells for. I should check, because it's not a great game, but I know it's out of print.
I'm looking it up now.
But while you do that, the sake of the fact that games like The Bouncer, where you can't get anywhere else, maybe classic vendors have it, but it's not in print. If someone were to download an emulator of the PlayStation and the PlayStation 2 and that game because they want to experience it, are they really wrong if Sony is not making it accessible to get that game? Like, it's the same idea that if an artist, like with the new Wu-Tang album that one guy, that rich asshole bought.
Yes.
And like there was only the one copy. Is it really bad for other people to get it illegally if there's only one copy in print and you can't buy it anywhere? Like, where's the line drawn with that stuff?
And the purpose of that Wu-Tang album was the idea of, it's not that it couldn't be distributed. It was that it couldn't be distributed for profit.
Right.
So whoever bid on it is then the arbiter of whether or not it gets released. But now they have this special thing that's there, so yeah. So, which says a lot about capitalism. But is this that kind of podcast? I don't know. Either way, the bouncer, if you could get anywhere from $12 to $20 for it, is a good price.
I mean, that's not terrible, all things considered. And I bought it used back in the day, so I'd probably still be making a profit.
Yeah, right. Well, if when we go to a video game con next weekend, we can I'll see what people are selling it for.
Okay. But yeah, it's just it's frustrating to really experience this disconnect between wanting the game and should I be able to access the game. And I think at the end of the day, I'm a firm believer in, I don't support emulation. As I said in our emulation episode, I don't support stealing new games. But if you want to play a game that you can't get anywhere and you emulate it so you can try it, I personally see no moral issue with that, because like all art, the experience of it is what matters most, not the profit or what's sold or who gets what. It's the fact that you get to have that experience.
Yes, you don't. There is no form of media outside of things that you experience in education, but no form of just pleasurable media that at the end of it you have to take a quiz to make sure you understood it or that you got the proper experience, unless that in itself was part of the exhibit. But you don't really run into that too terribly often. And there are people working their face off for no money, because these are labors of love, to translate games that didn't make it to America or to Europe, to make it so that something that would only work on one form of media or one form of hardware could be more readily played, could be more accessible. Something that could have been lost has come back. And I see no reason, because no one's profiting from the loss of those things. No one is profiting from selling a game that isn't understood by the native speakers of that area, making it accessible to them. You weren't putting money into it. And now that person's putting their own time, effort, and money into it. And yet, because of ownership and because of whatever else, you can send them a cease and desist and stop. Because again, we also don't look at the rights of games internationally and domestically. It's just they own the property. And I feel like some greater nuance is required going forward. I don't know what's going to make that happen, but I really want it to.
Yeah, totally. Of course, dear listeners, let us know what you think. As we've talked about with emulation last week, and again this week with just flat out ownership of art, it's a muddy topic, and there's not a wrong or right answer. At the end of the day, law begets morality sometimes. But let us know what you think. Like we said with emulation, if you think nobody has the right to own art and that you shouldn't be paying for it, like, give us your argument. I'm always willing to debate and want to hear what you all have to say, because at the end of the day, we do this podcast for the sake of the industry and the art and how much we love it as fans. And so engaging in that kind of conversation is super important to us.
Yeah, and we always enjoy engaging with all of you listeners on everybody's thoughts, memories, and ideas on all of this. Like, we don't want to be the be-all, end-all on these things. We just want to get people thinking.
Yes, absolutely. So, as always, thank you for listening. You can find us all over the internet, wherever you find podcasts and where you find your social medias. We love to hear from you. Also, check out our Certain Point of View brethren at Another Pass with Case Aiken, the Certain Point of View podcast, and, of course, Scruffy Nerf Herders. All great podcasts on our network. I love being a part of this group. Please check out their works too, especially if you love Star Wars, since 2 out of the 3 of those are all exclusively about Star Wars.
And if you want us to talk more about Star Wars, let us know. I've got stuff ready to go.
Yeah, seriously. I think I write Ben and Addie weekly about, hey, can we do this? Oh, I want to talk about this. Oh, we should do something about this.
Oh, yeah. We've got things in the works. Not sure how it'll all work out. Scheduling's a pain, but when it happens, I don't think there's anyone going to be more excited about it than me. So thanks again for listening. Thank you for being a part of the conversation. I'm Geoff Moonen.
And I'm Matt, a.k.a. Stormageddon.
And happy gaming.